Hello, my name is Jonathan Forster, and welcome to the Multi-Story Thinking podcast on interior design. I'm an interior designer and educator. My job is to improve quality of life and productivity by helping people to create beautiful and practical spaces to live and work in. The Multi-Story Thinking podcast takes an educational slant to the interior design world. If, like me, you are curious about how things are done within the industry, want to know how people got their breaks and how they've developed their careers, and get some top tips and advice, then this is the podcast for you. So sit back, relax, as we help unravel the mysteries of interior design. Jack Trench is the founder and director of Jack Trench Limited, who create award-winning handmade bespoke kitchens. They have a showroom in central London and offer a complete project-managed service from initial concept and design through to manufacture and installation. Since 2003, the company has maintained its original ethos of delivering high-end joinery, bespoke kitchens and finely crafted furniture, developing into a growing team of cabinet makers, site fitters, designers and studio staff. In this episode, we discover how a few jobs putting up shelves led to setting up a joinery business working across Europe, how concentrating on kitchen design helped focus their design philosophy, processes and business goals, why you need to understand people and how they tick, the importance of making collaborative decisions with contractors and clients, and why, when you get to site, everything goes out the window. Thanks for joining me, Jack. It's brilliant and great to see you again. It's been such a long time, hasn't it? And in that time, you've gone from, already established making business, haven't you, to something that looks like a huge organisation. It may appear like that from the outside, but
we try and convey a general vibe of being organised. I think with all businesses, sometimes behind the shutters, it's never quite as like that. But we seem to have a method and a system and a kind of have grown something which is, I think we've grown something that means we get to do really nice things.
Yeah,
fantastic. And I know part of this conversation is, I suppose, about that journey to where we've got to and where we are and what we do and what we might do next. But I think that we've always tried to develop what we're doing. And I think when we worked together a number of years back, we were kind of doing quite a lot of different stuff. I think we were kind of doing a range of design and manufactured and joinery works. We did a reception desk project together.
That's correct, yeah.
And actually, but where we are now is we're kind of doing our own high-end kitchen projects, and we have our own kitchen range and our own furniture. And it's sort of, we have all of the learning we've had over the last 20 years, we've then kind of managed to apply that into our own range of work, which then all of our kitchens and our work is bespoke, but all that learning is there. And I think it's as much through the good work that we've done and also the mistakes we've made. So I think they kind of say how great your work is often based on how many mistakes you made along the way. And often, we try not to talk about those, but it's the reality of everyone's work. I think we had a thing on our project together where we had this wonderfully detailed lighting that we'd kind of worked out. And then the very last hour of the weekend, because the weekend fit for you. So we're kind of working like dogs over the weekend before the Monday morning opening of the reception area. And we, in the last hour, turned our under reception lights on, and the beautifully polished floor reflected every single LED dot in the floor. And I think we had to do a lot of groveling. And thankfully, I think you had built a very good relationship with the client, and you were very generous to us, as was the client. And everyone said, don't worry, we'll just never turn those lights on.
I know. I mean, that's as much a design defect, isn't it, really? And yeah, I was surprised. And you think, oh dear. And we never do that again. No, no LED on polished terrazzo. But I think that's like you say, it's that learning process. And if the thing about what we do and what you do is you most of the time you're learning at the expense of someone else, aren't you, who's paying the bills? And that's often a tricky thing to navigate, isn't it, if there's a problem? But like you say, we got around it. They were very, I think the impact of the whole thing was such that actually that was such a small detail that they were happy to let it slide a little bit.
But I think what's interesting about the sector we're in, you know, if you're manufacturing, if you're an architect or an interior designer, or you're a manufacturer of bespoke and one-off pieces, everything you're doing is a one-off. It's effectively a prototype. You've never done it before. You're making it for the first time. There are thousands of variables that go into these projects. I mean, I think about a construction project. You've got something which is, you know, you take a high-end residential project in London or elsewhere. You've got a building that's usually 100 years old. You've got many parties and many kind of, different kind of things pulling at each other: budget, design, kind of design desires, quality, timing, and all these different, kind of players, the construction professionals, designers, client, and all of it is actually done by hand. You know, you've kind of got a guy with a trowel, plastering a wall, and a guy with a paintbrush, and you kind of got like a guy with a, who's sort of got a rake, who's kind of like pulling the leveling off the concrete that's been pumped in by a truck on a kind of residential street with kind of cars backed up trying to get through. And I think that, we're in a kind of age of technology, but residential high-end construction is 90% done by hand, and and the level of execution that people manage to get to, and the kind of quality of the outcome at the end of it is incredible. And the idea that you would go through a 2-year process flawlessly with a perfect outcome is just impossible. And I think what you're trying to do is make sure that the things that do come up along the way can be resolved either through kind of diligence in design process, sensible collaborative approaches during the making and installation of it, and people at the end of the line, clients and architects and designers, who understand that journey and the amazingness of the outcome. And when there is something which is a slight blip in the process, it's just about getting the result that everyone's happy with.
Yeah.
And not to confuse what I'm saying with mistakes are acceptable or imperfections acceptable. I just mean that the nature of the process means that you are going to have to navigate imperfection at some point.
Yeah.
And you want to get the outcome at the end that's as perfect as you can.
When you're looking at some of the images on your website, the kitchen unit, all parallel lines, clean, crisp, and that's designed presumably a little bit of sketch work maybe, but then into CAD, everything lines up, everything's parallel. And you go into site, and that's where you discover that the wall's not straight. And
yeah, absolutely. But that's also where I think the kind of experience of doing comes in. So how much tolerance you give, how much you kind of with the contractor work with them and say, look, this is going to be heavy. Your floor is going to sag there if we don't do this, or can we put some plywood there to secure back? But the whether it be when you're going through design concept development, which we'll talk about some of the kind of the processes of that later on, but concept development is one thing, and you're trying to give yourself during concept development the best chance of success while it meeting all the needs of the client and the job and what we're trying to achieve. And then design for manufacture is the kind of real brain of it. That's the kind of bit where you really, that's where you win or lose a job in terms of its success. And so in design for manufacture, you've got to be incredibly disciplined and diligent and kind of just follow through everywhere. You've got to rework and check and not assume anything. If you assume something, you get really burnt badly. So that side of things, which is run by actually my partner Ed, who's amazing in whole sector, you know, is sort of pure hard work and perspiration. And then it goes to the factory, and the guys do the manufacturing, who are skilled craftsmen, which are equally brilliant at problem solving. And then you get to site, and everything you've done and everything you planned and everything that was agreed is all out the window. So the contractor that promised you, he said, I promise you that wall will be straight, Jack. You don't need to worry. My plaster is the best plaster in the whole of Europe. You know, it's fucking bent. You know? And you say yourself, okay, right, what do we do? All right, so we split the difference there. You kind of move that a bit. You sort of, the guys on site say, well, if we shift that 5 mil across, the sight line there is going to be forgiving there. And, you know, if we pull that back a bit, and the floor line, you know, you kind of this kind of constant battle of, you've done everything based on the room being a certain way, and the flooring guys have set the hallway as their datum, and then your joint line of the floor is bent in relation to your joinery. So you pull it forward to cover a joint line, you twist it a bit to make it more parallel, you know, but that kind of, as you say, how you achieve that result at the end is extreme kind of planning, and the ability to, in a moment, be really flexible, and then kind of really understanding what's going to look bad and stick out, and what's going to be the right kind of tweak to make. And maybe that's experience, one, but often it just requires thinking. Like all these things that you see on site that people do that are nice details, they're often not harder to do. They just need to be thought about. So it doesn't take more time to do a plaster bead at this height or that height, but where that plaster bead relates to the joinery or whatever else is happening in the property might be the difference between a good and a bad job aesthetically or in junctions. But it's no more work to do it. You know, it's no more time physically executing it, but the planning and the thought process that goes into these things is the key to it. And I think that's, and all of this comes back to, if you're in design, you're in manufacturing, you kind of just got to care about what you're doing. If you care about it, you think about it, and then you'll get a much better outcome.
And to work with contractors who have the same level of care as well, I think that, or at least communicate what's important to you, to them.
But there's definitely a kind of, there's definitely a style on site. Like you kind of, I think to get the best out of people, you're trying to collaboratively make these decisions. So yesterday we were on a job. I went there to oversee some templating, and one of the sockets was not quite in line, and the electrician's there. And you sort of, so I said to the electrician, well, it's 5 mil out, what do you think? You know, I said, well, we'll probably get away with it, won't we? Let's just, I knew the journey I was going on, but I said, I think we'll probably get away with it. I mean, the client, you know, it's 5 mil out. Will they know? You know, they might read it, they might not. I mean, you know, what are we talking about here? Is it half a day to fix it? No, it's not half a day. It's nothing. You know, half an hour. I think we should do it, don't you? So he said, definitely we've got to do it. Definitely. I'm like, okay, great. Look, if you can do that, and we'll help you, and let's get it 5 mil perfect, and then everything's going to be right. But if you'd started that conversation saying, listen, your socket's out, raise it by 5 mil, you end up with a big battle. And there's definitely that sort of consensus building the whole way through. Your kind of consensus building and collaboratively making those decisions. And often you kind of know where you're trying to get to, but the way you navigate it with construction is a slightly different method, and it's a bit of a law unto itself. You know, there's no regulation in the UK. There's no qualifications. Anyone can be a builder. Anyone can turn up. Anyone can do anything, unless it comes to plumbing and electrics. They can still do it, but you're not certified. And so there is definitely a method of getting the best out of people. And I think that you just want everyone on side the whole way, and you want people to think that, you want to all have the same goal, but sometimes it needs a bit of bringing them along. That's all.
Yeah, you've got to jump across from that designer who wants every detail to be correct and communicate the importance of that, haven't you? And then, because lots of people would look at that and think, oh, what? No one's going to notice. You know, well, why is that important? What difference does it make? And that's where it starts to break down, doesn't it? Where you've got little niggly things that don't quite fit in. But you're describing the team and the process. If I can take you back to, before we started working together, which is when you were setting up the business, how did you get into it? What was your entry into setting up a joinery shop?
I think most people's professional kind of outcome is partly accidental and partly by design, and so I was always good at the kind of making and design side at school, or not good at it. I was always interested in it, what I like doing, kind of like we sort of, whether it be the kind of excitement of doing a project and bringing it in and kind of everyone seeing each other's work, and it's something that I like, the fact that you could see the quality of something, rather than it being an essay, which is just everyone's essay looks the same. I like this thing that you could just in a moment see what people have done and where the excitement is. And I remember my sort of first CDT teacher, he's brilliant, Mr. G. He sort of he stood in front of the whole class and he said, you're all going to, this is GCSEs now, so we're all sort of 14 years old, 15 years old. And he said, right, you're all going to pass. Some of you might pass better than others, but you're all going to pass and you're going to do what I tell you. And I'll give you an example of why you're going to pass. So he took a picture of a bit of paper and he drew a duck on it. And he sort of showed the class and he said, that picture of a duck, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? And we all, yeah, it's a bit rubbish. He then cut it out and he said, now I've cut it out and kind of made it a bit of a nicer space of the duck. It looks a bit better, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, it looks a bit better. He said, right, and I'm going to stick it on some yellow paper. So he stuck this thing on some yellow paper and he sort of said, now it's on some yellow paper with a border. It looks even better. Yeah. And then he cut it out neatly and did a nice border around it. And this crappy picture of a duck presented well, looked great. And the whole class was like, oh, looks all right. And so he sort of dragged us all along and inspired us all. And we all sort of, got into what he was about, which was a design, manufacture and CDT. So then I kind of, from that, went, did A-levels, went to university, studied industrial design. And that kind of process of design and all that goes with it was something that I loved, but I kind of thought I was going to be designing kettles and dashboards and kind of all of those things. And what you end up with is the people who are exceptional in industrial design go on do consultancies and they design cars and they design for Philips and whoever else. You can tell my age, but Apple or whatever it might be. And the people who are kind of like generally quite good, have to work a bit harder at it. And you might end up kind of working in-house somewhere. So I kind of put myself in the category of not being exceptional, but was quite good at it and was able to express my ideas, but not in the kind of like pure sheer talent that some of these guys had and some of these ladies had and, went into consultancy. Then when I kind of graduated, my uncle, who's an architect, he said, look, Jack, I'm a bit behind with some drawings. I sort of, I'm working by myself at the moment at home. He'd sold his practice in Prague and living in London. And he said, can you help me for a couple of days? And a couple of days becomes a couple of years. And that couple of years became a sort of like a mini apprenticeship in being a kind of an architect and a draftsman. And then the sort of two things came together quite nicely. He sort of said, look, I'm a bit of a quiet summer and, you might need to find something to do because he's sort of semi-retiring at that point. And I then kind of, through necessity, just sort of sending out flyers in North London, sort of local boy would put up shelves. And this is sort of before the internet being what it is now. And kind of, this is when we had yellow pages, this is when that was the sort of method of finding a tradesperson. So flying North London, and I got this kind of call and this lady said, when you come over and have a look, and I sort of turned up, and the first thing she said was, wow, you turned up, and I thought, if all you've got to do is turn up to be good, you're on a good start, so turned up to this job, they wanted some shelves and some joinery stuff doing, and it sounded quite comfortable with doing so. Did all that. And as a sort of 22-year-old Londoner, no one learns to drive in London when you're 20, 16. You just don't need to. So my mum was hiding around the corner. I'd kind of not shaven to try and look a bit older. And that was the beginning, that first job of the person saying, wow, you turned up. And, turned out I did one thing and it went quite well. And they said, can you do another? And that kind of went all right. And then I sort of someone recommended me to someone else, and then you sort of end up with a bit too much work. So you sort of call around and say, look, who knows someone that can help out? And then actually a friend of mine, he recommended a couple of friends of his that had studied cabinet making. So they mucked in, and we sort of were doing building work and whatnot. And then from there, we sort of got a van, and then a friend of mine said, look, I want to do a mobile cocktail bar. Can you help me? So we sort of, in this freezing garage of an old family friend, Christos Logothetis, who's kind of in the brain as the kind of incubator of all this stuff. You know, we were kind of in this garage next to his wife's physiotherapy practice, building this bar for a friend of mine who was going to do mobile cocktail bars. And at the end of that, there was kind of like, well, there's something in this, you know, kind of we can make stuff, and we don't need to just do building work. And so I then got a small workshop through Haringey Council in Seven Sisters. And it was the tiniest thing. It was the size of a car, but we sort of put a mezzanine in, and we sort of got some machines in there. And somehow, I've no idea how we produced the work we produced in that space. It was so small, but somehow we managed to do it. And we did, you know, we were doing kitchens and furniture. And then at some point, with the Yellow Pages, I phoned another company to ask them for advice or something, and then got to know this guy who was working there. And this guy turned out to be Ed, who's now my business partner. And he was moonlighting with me, doing some drawing work, and we really started working well together. And then we had so much work, we had to move to a bigger space. So we then got a huge workshop, well, huge, relatively speaking, a big workshop in Tottenham Hale. And from there, we sort of really grew the business. We grew the team into a great team of installers and fitters and design team, all of which kind of really driven by Ed, myself, and then the wider team of, you know, with all of the skills that they brought to the table. And it started as just bits of furniture. And by the time we kind of really got into our stride, we were doing exhibition builds to the Wellcome Trust, you know, work for Harrods, you know, jobs abroad. I mean, we did work in Spain, in Switzerland, in Sweden. And working abroad is, on paper, really easy. You do it, you make everything in London, in our factory, you turn up and you ship everything over and you do the fitting. But there were some insane times doing all that work abroad. I mean, you know, we did a job in Verbier where it was snowing. It was leading up to Christmas. There was a Christmas deadline, and there was this hill that everyone was trying to get up. And there were all these vehicles trying to get up this hill to get to this house to sort of do their work. Electricians, fitters, you know, all kinds of trades. And no one could make it up this hill. So you're going to have this scene of kind of snow and all these different people lugging their kit up this kind of hill. And one vehicle made it up, and they were the kind of heroes, and they kind of got to the top of this hill in their van or whatever it was. But so it got to the point where we're doing big work of a scale, of a quality all around Europe, which was amazing and really satisfying. But we kept on coming back to our kitchens. We're always doing our kitchens. And we kind of made the call. We said, look, let's just stick with what we're really, really always excited about. Stick with the kitchen work. But it had to be something, wasn't just reactive. You know, you kind of normally with these things, you're reactive to something and it grows through your reaction to what comes to you. But with the development of the kitchen work, we really sought it out. We really kind of said, right, that's what we're going to do. Let's really focus on it and let's apply ourselves to that, rather than it just being we do as many as turn up and we do whatever else turns up. And so there was this charity in central London and Clerkenwell called Craft Central that had studio spaces for jewelers and metalworkers and artisans. But on street level, they had this huge exhibition space, and you could, because it was a charity, you could rent it for £500 a week. So we booked it for 2 weeks and we went for it. I mean, we got framed pictures of every piece of our work. We built a whole platform to elevate it. We built a kitchen island to go in there. And in 2 weeks, we booked a year's worth of work from this one exhibition. And that was the kind of real turning point. And we did it again. And then we got a showroom in the Business Design Centre, like a sort of an office suite. And then about 5 years ago, or pretty much 5 years to next month, actually, we got a shelled space in Rosebery Avenue, which was a shop front. We renovated it And by then we kind of put all of our, this kind of fully formed and fully evolved set of furniture and kitchen projects, then kind of formed this showroom, and people really understand what we're about when they're there. They come in, they understand the thinking, they understand the quality, they understand what we're about and why we're different to other people. And that has been the kind of, the journey from 20 years of sort of designing and making to where we are now has really culminated in the showroom that we've got in central London, which is amazing. And as a kind of small business with no external investment, it's a really, we feel very fortunate. We've had a bit of luck and a lot of hard work, and clients and people that are around us have always been really supportive, and it's a lovely kind of place to have got to. So that's the journey so far.
It's quite, that's a great story, and I think I'm interested in the sort of shift from what you say being responsive to what's coming in. I'm guessing that's, people like us as interior designers calling you saying, can you make this desk? We've designed it all and we need someone to make it, to the point where you're actually starting to develop your own ranges of furniture. So it's more about your design work, which must be more rewarding, is it? Or do you get value out of both types of work?
The process for making that change has, the work is different. It's very rewarding that you have something which you've grown and people respond to. But to be honest with you, the work's always rewarding because you're always doing it together, whether you're doing it at the beginning where it's no set range and you're working collaboratively, or whether you're working within the kind of design parameters but still bespoke. And although we work within a design set of design parameters, our kitchens and our work is always different. But in all instances, you're working together. And at the end of it, actually, what you're trying to do is get to a point whereby the client just kind of feels like it's their design. And actually, the client almost feels like no one really kind of did anything. And actually, someone looks at it and they sort of think, well, there's no real work here. I mean, it's obvious that would be the answer. And almost you want to be invisible in the process, not in the process, sorry, in the outcome. So in the outcome, you kind of want people to think that it was the only natural answer for the building and the way the building was designed, that thing lived there. For the client to kind of be like, yeah, we sort of worked together on it, but they kind of, I always told them I wanted it like this, and that's how we got to it. But the amount of rework to get it, to that point, it was off the chart. And the design, kind of team, and if you're working with an architect, for them to kind of feel like their vision of what they wanted to do, we kind of slotted into it almost smooth, it's kind of smoothly and seamlessly. But in the background, you're sort of pedaling like mad to kind of get this end result. So it is rewarding. It's great to have got to a point whereby, what we're doing is based on our experience and knowledge. But in many ways, the purpose of having a range is not to do with ego, it's to do with quality of execution. So if you're that comment earlier about every job being a prototype, if you can try and reduce the amount of variables, then you've got a smoother process in getting a perfect outcome.
Yeah.
And so it just reduces the kind of designing everything from scratch and not reinventing the wheel, but trying to give enough flexibility and enough kind of design parameters and range for someone to get exactly the outcome they want.
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of your expertise, and clearly there's the making and the installation. How about the understanding of how people use the space and essentially cooking and entertaining? Are you influencing the way the spaces are set out based on your experience? Because I know, you might get supplied an architect's drawing of the layout. To what extent are you able to influence that? And that must be something that's possibly evolving as well as people are using their spaces differently. But just how does your expertise come out in that area of the design?
So I think I thought before we had this call today, I was thinking a lot about what the design process is and who are the kind of elements and the people and the kind of the key players in it, and how do you get the outcome? So the first thing is that when you're working with a client, it's not personal, but it has to be a personal relationship. Like, you have to understand who it is that you're working for and doing this thing for. And so people will often sort of say, well, this business is not personal, or, you shouldn't get so personally involved, and it's not a reality when you come to doing design work for people. And when you're doing design work for residential projects, you need to understand the people. You need to understand how they tick. You need to understand what their lives are made up of, what their families are, what their work is, the way they, are they messy? Are they tidy? Are they kind of very organized? Are they a bit of a whirlwind? Are they, is the kind of the mother-in-law always over? Or the kind of, there's 5 teenage kids causing a mayhem? And I think a good explanation of why it's good to know them is, I remember years ago, my uncle recommended me these kind of business CDs, business life cycle CDs. So these 5 CDs I'd listened to in the van, and and he was talking about the way people's brains work. And he said, well, if someone's a creative brain, I mean, in the broadest sense, creative brain versus an administrative brain. And I don't mean in terms of profession, I just mean the way people are wired. So if you say to a creative brain, I like the idea of doing X, what do you think? And a creative brain will say yes if they like it, and they'll say maybe if they hate it. So maybe is no, and yes is yes. And if you take an administrative brain and you say, I was thinking about, X, what do you think? No means no, and maybe means yes. So, you've got 2 different brains whereby maybe for one means no and maybe for one means yes. And so you've got to kind of get to know people, and you've got to understand when they sit there and they sort of say, well, you sort of see their kind of their left eye twitch a little bit. What does that mean? And so once you've kind of got a bit of an insight into the person and to the family and to what they're about, you can then really kind of look at evolving this design and what they want. And they may say, look, I'm not a big entertainer now, but I'd like to be, or, I've always been into cooking, but never had the kind of ability to do it. But a lot of things are just they're very logical. Like the first thing is you're putting something into a building, and that building is the sort of unspoken client. You've got to respect the space that you're working to. These buildings, it might be a modern insert, it might be a traditional kitchen, but you've got to respect and give breathing space to the way in which you're interacting with this building, and the way it touches the building, and the way in which, when you enter a space, what you see, what the flow is, where people, will they enter through the doorway that was the living room and goes to the kitchen, or the back, or they come into the house from the rear. But I think that the sight lines you come into, what do you see? What have you given breathing space to? How much people want their kitchen space to be a kind of a bunker where they're kind of defending themselves against everyone else, and they're like, this is my domain, or how much they want it to be open. How much do they, people talk about a breakfast bar, and no one has breakfast at a breakfast bar, but they want to perch. They want to be able to sit, have a think, plan their day, write an email, check their mail, whatever it might be. But I think with all these things, you understand the person and what they're about, and their kind of the family units, whether it be 1 or 7 people. You've got to understand the space and the building and what the building's about, and the kind of history of it, and how you're interacting with it. And then you've got to understand the kind of wider context. So if it's a building that's got an architect, the wider context of what they're trying to achieve, and how you build on that rather than kind of being at odds with it. And then obviously you've got the contractor and all the things that we touched on before. But the design process, I think, is built on all those things. And I feel that at the end of it, going back to that point about you want it to seem effortless, you want the client to kind of feel that it was effortless. You want the building to feel like it's a natural connection of what you've done and what you're putting into that space. And and it's a bit like, you know, you kind of say with building projects, you often don't know when there's an architect, but you really know when there isn't. And you're trying to have a similar approach whereby, you know, you want people to not really notice how much effort's gone in, but there really has been a lot of effort, and it needs to feel natural. If that sort of answers your question.
Yeah. Well, that's about building that relationship, isn't it? And understanding how people operate. And I suppose we've all got in our heads the classic triangle layout of a kitchen, haven't we? I mean, that's not something one should stray too far from, I always think. But to what extent have you seen, I don't know, design trends of the way kitchens have been used, influencing the designs? And I'd also be interested in your approach to materials as well, because you've got very nice selection of materials on your website, which is, I guess, less. Well, I mean, what's your thought on materials? I'm seeing sort of things that don't feel like kitchens, you know, although they function as a kitchen, but they have an aesthetic which is more aligned to more sort of hospitality spaces or living spaces. But
well, I think so. Going back to the first question about the kind of trends and the spaces, I think I would generally say that people are wanting to be more open. I don't think it's anything that's it's not a kind of new trend in terms of the last 6 months. I would say in terms of, you know, in more recent years, especially in relation to the age of these buildings. So if these buildings are 100 years old, the way they were designed then and the way they were used then to now are worlds apart. And I do think that particularly the way in which people work and the way in which people are very kind of constantly on the move, but constantly engaged, that these open spaces and kind of connecting all these people is very important. So whether it be which way people face when they're cooking, the use of islands, the use of peninsulas, the kind of just that connectivity between someone being in the kitchen and then being linked to everyone else, I think is very important. In terms of the kind of the layouts and you said refer, you know, to a triangle, I think just logical thinking in terms of distances and using the space and how people will travel from one zone to another. And this goes back to also understand the client. So one type of client would be very happy having their sink on an island facing out, and they'll be very organized, and they say, look, this is what I like because I like to see my family while I'm preparing something. And someone else will say, are you completely mad? My sink is always covered in kind of old coffee pots and sort of like pots and pans. And the idea of that being on an island facing out to the main space is completely illogical to me. So, you know, the two things do link to the client. But kind of moving on from that, as you say, in terms of the kind of material choices and the way in which our kitchens are evolved and the way in which people use materials, I think one of the things that we did as a real departure from maybe many other companies is that we don't do painted kitchens. So we don't do lacquered kitchens. So we don't get, you know, lacquered kitchen is a bit of MDF. It's sprayed in polyester or polyurethane paint. It looks great on day one and it's chipping away over time. So people are given touch-up paint and they touch up the corner on the bin and the dishwasher where it's been damaged. And that's the story for almost all bespoke kitchens. And then people will use it, maybe instead of that, use a laminated exterior, but then you kind of get chipping on the laminate, the kind of black corner that everyone sees where you've chipped a corner where the expansion and contraction of the sub material and the laminate means it's kind of overhanging and can chip. What we started to do a number of years ago is we actually clad all of our kitchens in Corian. So a white kitchen for us is clad in Corian. And so it makes it absolutely bomb-proof and allows us to kind of express the craftsmanship of manufacture. And not everyone wants a white kitchen, and you know that. So we've also then evolved to using a product called Rich Lights, which is like a resin-infused paper. And we use different types of color core laminates. So the product called Phoenix, which is a self-healing laminate. But it's not just about that. You know, there's the kind of wanting to design in longevity and robustness and quality, but it's also the balance. So the material choices for a kitchen, often a starting point for that is, what's the floor going to be? So if the floor is going to be not wood, concrete, tile, terrazzo, whatever it may be, it means you've got a bit more room to maybe add more timber without it fighting with the floor and without things clashing. and it not being too much like one client put it, like a trapper's cabin, you know. If the floor is going to be timber, then you've got to be very careful how you navigate that, how you don't just make it too woody, and also so not clashing with each other. So if it's a timber floor, we might say, well, look, let's do our fronts as non-timber, whether it be, you know, white or coloured or whatever it may be. And then let's look at using timber in a more light touch way. So maybe part of the full height area or in the fingerboard details where the upper cabinetries are. But it's not a hard and fast rule. It's more to say the floor will often define the approach to everything else. Then use of materials like marble. So I love marble. I love putting marble in our kitchens, but it can't be done too ostentatiously. Marble brings a real beauty to a project because every piece of marble is different and unique, and you're bringing this kind of, you know, I mean, it's millions of years old. It's been cut perfectly in the quarry to kind of express the best of the structure. It's then shipped to the UK. Then the fabricators will then work with it, comes to site, and so you're kind of applying. You're trying to get perfection out of something that's imperfect by its very nature, but it can really bring a depth to a project when combined in the right way that's really special. So the use of marble, the use of natural timbers, combined in a restrained way with other materials like corian or steel or other, you know, kind of more, let's say, man-made approaches. And that balance, I think, is key. And also that relates to the amount of light in a space. So when you've got a lot of light, you've got different options. But darker spaces, you need to take a different approach. So, and all of that with a view that you're not trying to look at it like a kitchen, it's trying to be furniture. So you're taking an approach to find furniture, you're kind of adapting that, and you're applying that furniture ethos into fitted joinery and then extending that into kitchen work. So that's our take on materials. And then with all of that, you've got material choices, design, layout, development, clients, and all of it stands for nothing if the execution and the detailing and the delivery is not there. So you then say, well, I've got my layout, I've got my kind of understanding of what's happening, I've got my materials, we've got our space, and now what do we do with this thing? How do we turn this group of elements into something that's a perfect outcome? And then you get into the sheer perspiration that is detail design, and you got to follow the line. You got to pick a detail, you look at it, and you just keep following it. And where does it terminate? Where does it end? What's happening with the skirting? Where does it finish in relation to something? And you just keep doggedly figuring that out, reworking it. And if you can get that bit right with all the other bits we talked about and deliver it well, you've got a great project. But if you misstep on things like the detail and the execution, all the other bits under kind of closer scrutiny just fall apart.
I'm just looking at some of the images on the website. The corian clad door and sort of drawer pull features, beautiful piece of detailing.
I'm glad you like it.
And I mean, that's what, I mean, the question is, I suppose, from the average person who's never gone down this route, is what's the difference between me going to IKEA or Howden's and this, you know? And actually, when you inspect the detail of how it's constructed, it's just screaming out, isn't it? The attention to detail and the sensitivity around materials. And I think what's really nice, I suppose, is that approach to the qualities of the materials themselves, you know, the textures and the colors, texture of marble, the pattern of marble, and what that brings to a space. It's a nice, there's some really great shots on the website. I'll put a link in the notes, but and of course, every job seems to be different. You're still dealing with the fundamentals of cooking and eating and preparing food and storing food. But like you say, it's the location, it's the client, it's the context of light, it's the amount of space, the personalities, you know, all those things seem to enable you to then produce something that is unique every time.
Question on materials, the way in which we've approach that, and every kind of company as well. I think we've got our approach to materials, and I can see other companies also do great things, and they have their look, and I think each kind of designer and company will kind of have you can tell it's one of their projects. So you can often, if you see a Jack Trench kitchen, you can see it's a Jack Trench kitchen. If you see a kitchen by another firm, you can tell it's one of theirs because they've got their kind of elements. And I think where Ed and I and the wider team have really kind of tried to stick to is the kind of integrity of design, integrity of materials. So when you talk about the cladding and that detail and the way in which we express timber, there is a kind of an honesty in it, which I think is important to us, and I think that's why architects love our work. I think the approach to it. So, for example, I think one of Ed's pet hates, which I 100% agree with, is when people have fake handles on in front of a sink. Yeah. So you've got a sink front that can't be opened. You've got two handles on it. And you could probably, you could use that kitchen for years and still absentmindedly pull the handle at the sink area, which is crazy. So I think that kind of the sort of discipline of, maintaining that integrity, I think is really important. And actually, what's interesting about the process is that, by my nature, I can kind of get quite enthused by things. And I sort of, I'll come back to I say, right, okay, we've got this job and we want to do this and we want to do that. And the client, and kind of, because context is everything as well. So the context of the job and the client, and you sort of, okay, we've got this idea, we can do this. And then sometimes Ed will just be like, you're mad. Like, what? Why would you do that? And just cut through everything and just take a step back and be like, look, let's just go back to our principles: simplification, quality of materials, proportion, and you kind of need that process as well. You need to be excited, but you need a kind of bit of a sense check as you go along the way. And yeah, I think that is a very important part of it. One of the things as well, I'm sort of slightly off piste here, but I was thinking about design process as well, and I was thinking about design development. So we talk about design development, and we've talked about layout, materials, clients, etc., but also how people design develop. So I was thinking, what is it that we do? What do other people do? So we all sketch, we all think, we all put stuff on CAD, and how do we use it? Why are we using it? What's it for? So if you're sketching, you're often sketching. It's almost like RAM. You're kind of storing your thoughts as you progress something. But some people do that differently. Their brains might be, have a bigger capacity to store that. But for me, put it on paper, store the thinking, then you might move on to CAD, or you might move on to other ways of doing it, but they're all for different purposes. So when you are trying to work with a client and express something to a client, you must be able to, in that moment, express yourself well. And I think sketching is really important to that. But when you're doing your design development work away from the client, you've got a bit more leeway to kind of find your own path, and whether it be more on CAD, more on paper, more in the brain, there's a bit more flexibility there. But if we talk about how you design something, I think people's ability to express themselves through sketching is very important, and so that you maybe gets lost a little bit in the CAD process.
Yeah, there's some nice images on your website of what I take to be one of your sketches, Jack, I hope, but it's hand-drawn elevation,
yeah,
annotated, a few dimensions, beautifully drawn. It's not particularly tight and neat like a CAD drawing. It's got, wobbly lines, and you can see it's hand-drawn, and I really like that because that's a quick way of developing an idea or communicating an idea, and it's drawn to scale, and that's sort of thing we're trying to encourage our students to do. That's a starting point, isn't it, of just evolving an idea, I guess, with you, and you move into the CAD later on.
Well, I think that also that if a design process means that your thinking is as wide at the beginning as it can be. So it's like a triangle, isn't it? The end of the job is the point, and everything leading up to it is this kind of wide-based triangle. And so at the beginning, you're thinking about every different material, every different layout, every different possibility, and it's kind of light touch. It's kind of wide and shallow thinking. And then as you sort of move further up, you're kind of trying to get in more and more controlled and more decisions, and you're trying to not wildly swing from one side to another, but get more and more focused as you go. but your medium for doing that also needs to be reflective of the stage in the process. So at the beginning of the process, it might be really quick, kind of sketchy ideas. There's no proportion, there's no scale. It's just to kind of say, look, we could do this way, sort of. And the client sort of says, I hate that, I like that, that's great. And then you sort of next bit is, does the idea that we've talked about have legs? And so to understand if it's got any legs in it, you've got to kind of commit a bit more information. And that point is, for us, is often the kind of hand-drawn but to scale. So you're saying, right, what's the reality of the space? You draw your room. So you've got your parameters. And then what's the reality of a worktop height or an appliance where you've got some parameters, but it's pointless doing it if it's not to scale. So you work to scale, but hand drawing is fine. And it doesn't matter about whether the end scribe is 32 mil or 36 mil. You just need to know broadly, what am I looking at to scale? And then the next stage will be kind of more concept CAD work, but again, more information, correctly understanding the things that are going in it, the space that it's interacting with. And then by the time that design work is finished, you're talking about like absolute pinpoint accurate CAD work with, you know, kind of to the millimeter detailed. And that's what I mean, that kind of triangle whereby at the beginning it's so broad. But I think that the freeness and looseness of the thinking has to be very open at the beginning. And there's no stupid ideas. There's no, you kind of almost brainstorm. I mean, kind of in an informal way, you're just sort of brainstorming with the client and throwing things out there. And the kind of value in that, I think, can really push things along. I remember an anecdote one of my teachers told me years ago. He sort of talked about brainstorming, and he said, well, you know, you got to understand, you haven't done stupid ideas. You know, so I think there was a kind of power company that was struggling because they had snow sitting on top of their power lines, and they were weighing down these power lines, and they were causing no end of trouble for this company. And they kind of had, you know, weight on the lines, stressing the system. And they were like, how are we going to do this? And people were coming up with ideas. And someone sort of said, well, you know, what if we got like a big bear to come and shake the pylon, and all the snow comes off the kind of wires, you know? And then that kind of evolved to them getting a helicopter and flying over the wires, and the vibration from the blades dropping all of the snow off. So this kind of stupid idea of this huge bear shaking the pylons evolved in such a really practical solution that they kind of came up with. And so I always like that, and the kind of idea that you just sort of, I think with clients, you know, often they're coming to us because they're not creative thinkers. And, you know, you might make a fool of yourself by saying something stupid, but if it gets your result, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But that's really at the base level and the widest point. But, you know, we don't talk about big fat bears coming in at the end.
The bear in the corner. I like the approach of that and that sketchiness of that starting point. And you talk about also development of ideas. To what extent are you, doing R&D or testing new things out in the background? Because it would be easy for you to be just knocking out the same stuff, wouldn't it, time after time? You must be thinking about different ways of doing stuff. And where does that inspiration come from? And do you get enough time to do that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm always astounded by, and Ed and I and the team, we're always astounded by how much R&D there is, even when on paper it is just, it's a Korean classic. It's got a marble top. It's got a stainless steel bit here. It's got and so on paper it's a very straightforward project to execute. And yet, even within that, the amount of R&D that goes into it, the way in which you kind of got to cantilever something, or the way in which you're trying to resolve an issue, because the R&D side of things, it's not just product development, it's not just material development, but that's always in sort of tandem. It's just about how you resolve a problem and how you tackle a new problem and a new thing, and that time and effort that goes into it. But 100%, the kind of, if we talk about it in a more basic sense, the kind of R&D being how do we evolve our products and what we're doing, we are very much in the spirit of continual and persistent incremental development. So, you've kind of got, you're just, you look at the problem. And so a typical thing that we would find, or not typical, an example of what we would find is we used to do our finger pull scoop the whole way along a door. But actually, when you've got a fridge or something where it needs to be open on one side, we then kind of evolved that to mean the finger pull is just on one side. Then you sort of, well, that bit of timber there, we noticed that was peeling a bit in manufacturing. We had to sand that a little bit more than expected. So then we'd change that, or, we changed the way we cut the timber. So we cut the timber that way and it doesn't move in the same way. Or R&D in terms of manufacturing processes, like how do you get the best out of your machines, your processes, your team? So there's always, 20% R&D in the background to the kind of other work. And also different members of the team are doing more and less of it. Like Ed will be, so much of his work is that product development, whereas his team and his designers and draftspeople, they will be more on kind of project execution, while he's then kind of in the background developing those ideas and those thoughts. We're very much a fan of not kind of wild changes, but just incremental evolution. And like a really nice example of that is we have our mid-century range, which is this kind of mid-century handle. It's a kind of protruding handle in the spirit of the sort of Danish pieces of the past. And I look at the first one we did sort of 15 years ago. This is really kind of clumsy, badly proportioned, kind of protruding handle. And then that sort of went through and you thought, we'll continue that cut through and let's change the shape of that. And let's put a bit of a rake on that bit and a chamfer there. And that curve was a bit, too kind of clumsy. And then it's evolved into this really elegant, beautiful handle. But that handle's probably gone through 20 changes and to get to that point. So it's always there and it's always happening, but maybe not in the kind of such a dramatic way as you might see with some other companies and the way they approach things.
Yeah, well, it's nice to see that you're thinking about it as you're going through each install. What's the typical route to get you onto a job then? Do they need an architect, or what's the best sort of setup? Can they come straight to you as a customer?
So we get a bit of a mix. So we find a lot of people will come to us if they, not necessarily on the scale of the job, but often it's just doing their kitchen, or they're just doing something small. Then they'll have us on board, and the design, they may come to us and say, I've got something I quite like to do, but it might be as simple as a line on a bit of paper or something they've thought about more. People come and see us, and we have an initial phone call, and then they come to our showroom and we have a kind of initial consultation, and then that leads into us, putting together a proposal for a client. And very often it's an architect or interior designer who will come to us, and they'll come to us with a wider project and say, look, we're doing this renovation project. We're trying to find someone as a specialist for the kitchen. We're aware of you, and can we look at this area? But it's very much, we're not only working with architects or only interior designers or only developers or only end clients. Really, it's just about, does what we're about fit with the project and the end user and the journey they want to go on? So we find that there is a range, and usually it is work in London properties, but we do work outside London, as we talked about before. But the first point for most of these things is for people to come and see us, see what we're about, and understand the product in detail, because really it's very difficult to express that subtlety of quality in photography. And a lot of people come and see us and I say, look, your photography is great, but actually I didn't quite appreciate what I was looking at until I saw it in the flesh. And I think that's why the showroom has been so good. 20 years ago, I'd go around with a plywood box, kind of saying, here are some samples. And we've come a long way from there. And now our sample box is a, showroom in central London, which is lovely.
Yeah. And what makes a successful project then? Is there a single thing that you can pinpoint?
I think a successful project, it's about there is often project fatigue. So clients are embarking on 2 years worth, or maybe 6 months, but whatever it is, it's an extended period of time of extreme stress. When it comes to manufacturing, that's fairly straightforward. The client's not really involved in it. But when it comes to construction projects, the clients are living and breathing this journey from the beginning to people digging up their home, building an extension or whatever else it may be. And at the end of it, when all is said and done, what is a successful project is something which is after the 2 months worth of kind of dust settling and the client saying, God, that was a really full-on process, that they just say, this thing works so well. You know, they kind of like, they say, I read an email from a client that just said, God, this thing is like, you know, it just works. It works in terms of the way we interact with it. It works in terms of the way the materials feel in the room, the way in which we interact as a family. And you just want the thing to kind of, to do its job well, and for the kind of pain that's and the blood that's gone into this thing to kind of be forgotten. And all of the, you know, whether the contractor put the wrong concrete in and whether the kind of, you know, the paint color was wrong because someone got the wrong swatch, all of that is irrelevant. And someone says, do you know what? That was hard work, but God, it was worth it. So a successful project to me is to do with the perfection of the end result rather than the kind of bumps in the road along the way, which is just comes with the territory of high-end construction.
That's great. We've done 1 hour and 6 minutes. That's brilliant. Should we get on to page 2 of your notes?
Yeah. I was going to say I've got nothing left, you know. So, I will. But one thing as well, when, you know, I've got my page which says conclusion, so it's probably a time place to get to that. So, yeah. I think that
very well organised, Jack. I'm very
organised. You know, high-end manufacturing. So what does that mean? So I think one is it gives a chance for people to create things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Yeah. You know, often people are making choices with their finances, and they say, right, you know, what can I do with this? Do I want to renovate my home? Do I want to buy a new car? Do I want to travel the world? And often people make that choice and they say, look, I want to do something with my home and I want to build this thing and I want to create something. And to be part of that is a real privilege, because when I started as a designer, I had no idea that I'd be doing this. And I had no idea that someone would be willing to pay for us to be creative and to manufacture and deliver the things that we do. And I think that as a result of that, you know, we're fortunate in that our profession gives us a tangible outcome. We've got a thing that we can think about, understand, see, we've created it. And it might be incredibly stressful at times in the doing, but it is a deeply rewarding thing to have done. Like when you finish a project and you think back about all the things that you do, whether it be a project you finished the day before or 20 years ago, it has a kind of a deep feeling of satisfaction that I think that people in the kind of creative industries and the manufacturing industries and construction have, that I think that is quite special to it. And it you know, a lot of hard work and stress goes into it. And I think I'd speak for people across the profession, but at the end, it feels very, very satisfying. And I think that's something that for people coming into it, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy profession to be part of, but you'll get a sense of satisfaction from it that is unlike another. And I think that's an important thing to kind of maybe to end on.
I'd like to thank Jack for taking the time to speak to me. It's really nice to see the work that he's producing and also the attention to detail and the process of design that he goes through. There's a real sensitivity both to the people that are using the space, but also the space itself and the designers and contractors involved in the whole design process. I like the way in which he looks at the design process and the stages as you move towards finalising the design, the importance of sketching, the importance of testing and trying ideas, and the hands-on approach to developing details and improving design over time shows a real focus on the craft of what he's doing. There's a link to his website and the showroom in central London on the show notes. That hands-on approach to crafting the interior is something that we promote at the University of Plymouth on the interior design course. If you'd like to know how to be a kick-ass interior designer, follow the links in the show notes. I'd like to thank Dave Clark from I Am The How for production support and invaluable advice in the setting up of this podcast. Kay Hansen for her planning support and co-hosting for these and our educational podcasts at the University of Plymouth. And Mark Frith for the music. I'd really like to hear your feedback on the podcast. Leave a comment or get in touch via the website or Instagram. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Thank you.